Anyway, it's a great pleasure to introduce Antoine Gloria from Sorbonne, and he will be talking about Einstein's effective viscosity formula. Thank you, Antoine.
Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation. I was looking forward to go to Boston. Couldn't. So today I've decided to talk about Einstein's effective viscosity formula. So that's very vintage, if you like, because that's a very old result of 1905, which has regained quite some interest in the past few months or past few years. So everything I will talk about is joint work with Nithya Durings from CNRS at Orsay. So I will organize my talk as follows. First, I will remind you the historical context of why did Einstein look at this problem. Then I will tell you what an effective property is, at least in the case of this viscosity in fluids. Then I will try to discuss how we can model a dilute system. So what is diluteness in such a system? And the whole aim of the talk is to answer this simple question: can we get more information on effective properties if your system is dilute? Because it's perturbative in some sense. And so the answer is yes, and I will tell you how to do that. So for people who know me, of course, I will try to find the corrector equation in the way. So in some sense, the message will be to study this kind of corrector equation, which is, so a corrector equation will be for me something which characterizes the effective property. And it characterizes this effective property regardless of the dilute regime, which is important because in some sense it allows you to distinguish first the separation of scale assumption, which tells you that there exists an effective property, from the diluteness assumption. And then I will establish some kind of Taylor expansion with respect to dilution parameters. The question is, what will be these parameters? And this will allow me to reinterpret all the zoo of results in physics. So there are many approximations which bear many names. And at some point here, I will give a nice classification of all that. And I will try to do it in a robust way. So I will present you the most general results available and in settings which have not been addressed before and which are quite challenging. And actually, I like this set of results because it uses a lot of nice ingredients like combinatorics, analysis, probability, and calculus of variations. So a lot of ingredients from all over.
We don't hear you anymore, Antoine.
You are muted.
I unmute myself and the oops, and I have to share again. I made a mistake. Okay, it's shared again?
It is.
Yes, okay. So let me start with the historical context. So we are in 19. The beginning of the 20th century, there's still a raging debate on the existence of atoms. And so you might know the 1905 papers by Einstein. There are at least 3 of them. And one of them, which is not so well known right now, although it's very cited. In this paper, Einstein devises an experiment to measure the Avogadro number. And that's based on viscosity measurements of water with and without dissolved sugar. And so his analysis is based on 2 relations, so two new relations, which now bear his name. So the first one is Einstein relation in kinetic theory. That one is very well known. And the second one is the Einstein relation for the effective viscosity. And since the Avogadro number appears linearly in both relations, then you just get it out of solving a 2x2 system when you have the measurements. And actually, it was very close to the value of the Avogadro number, like 1 or 2%, after correcting a mistake that Einstein did in the calculation. And actually, this was the basis of very nice experiments by Jean Perrin. And he presented that at the first Solvay colloquium in Brussels. Okay, so if you see this little picture, so the blue is water because water is blue, and then you have this sugar, these particles of sugar, which are white. And if you assume that the viscosity of the water is 1, that the particles are spherical and they have density lambda, then the apparent viscosity of the fluid is given by 1 plus 5/2 of lambda in dimension 3. So that's Einstein's formula. I must say that this kind of dilute expansions were not new in physics at that time. It was very well known in conductivity. That was the work of Clausius and Mossotti. It was popularized by Maxwell and Rayleigh. And for fluid, Einstein was the first one to use that or to make such an expansion. And if you look at this expansion, of course, it's first order. And you might ask whether you can go to second order. And actually, that's what bachelors did, but we had to wait till the 70s to have that. And the reason for this is that there's a difficulty in there. And the difficulty comes from a renormalization, which is needed. If you do nothing, actually, the second order term is infinite, which is bad. Okay, so to start slowly, let me give you the example of the effective conductivity. So now I change the model. So I have a picture of a material. Blue is conductivity alpha, white is conductivity beta. I'm solving a conductivity problem. And I assume that the size of the white inclusions is epsilon. And I let epsilon go to 0. Of course, I assume that the set of points is random, that it's stationary and ergodic. And when epsilon goes to 0, then we know that the solution U epsilon converges to the solution of a problem of the same form with the same boundary condition, the same right-hand side. The only thing which changes is the conductivity, which is now an effective conductivity. Since I've assumed that my system was stationary, the set of points is stationary, then the A bar does not depend on the space variable, and I've assumed it's ergodic, so it's actually deterministic. And it's given by a formula. That's the average, the stochastic average of the flux of the so-called corrector, which solves this elliptic equation with coefficient with conductivity A. That's on the whole space. Okay, so you just take the flux of some forcing or linear forcing. The important thing is that you have a formula. Now you assume that the density of the inclusion is small, say theta is very small. Then, of course, if there's no inclusions, then your effective conductivity is alpha. That's the conductivity of the background. And you're asking yourself, what would be the first correction in theta? So to do that, you just take the formula for your homogenized conductivity, and you distinguish whether you're in the phase alpha or in the phase beta. So here I'm in the phase alpha, here I'm in the phase beta. And the first thing is this gradient as expectation 0, so it disappears. I have alpha E, then I have beta minus alpha times something. I condition on being, I condition that 0 is in my set inclusion. I put the probability here of 0 being in the set of inclusion. This gives me theta, essentially. And that can be approximated by the problem with one single inclusion at 0 and no other inclusion. Essentially, this approximation tells you or relies on the assumption that particles do not see each other if they are in the dilute regime. So essentially, you look at the contribution of one single particle. This would be the contribution of one single particle. Phi tilde is the explicit solution of one single inclusion in the whole space. And when you do that, it leads to the so-called Clausius-Mossotti formula, where you have an explicit form for the first order correction. Of course, there's a gap to go from there to there. And the question is, how can you justify this? Okay, but before I justify, I need to understand what people mean by the dilute regime. So since I'm a mathematician, what I like is to have a sequence of things and then go to the limit, right? So I need to understand how to sin a point process. Give yourself a point process, then make it thinner. So here I've drawn a point process. So actually my nephew did it. And then we thinned it in two ways. So can you, by just looking at the pictures, can you find how I did it? So they look a bit like the same, right? I did two different things. Well, for one, I thinned by dilation. Namely, I took the point set and I dilated the distances. So points which were at distance 1 are now at distance r, dilation. For the other one, I thinned by random deletion. Namely, I attached to each point a Bernoulli variable with parameter b. And then I said that I kept a particle independently of the other with a probability b. Okay, so what's the effect on the intensity? Well, when you dilate things, it's just the Jacobian, so that's just r to the minus d. And when you do this Bernoulli deletion, that's p, you multiply by p, the probability that you kept the point. So there's only one single point process for which you have identity of the two laws, dilation and random deletion. That's for the Poisson point process, when p equals r to the minus d. So it will be quite clear in the analysis that p and r to the minus d play similar role. But there's a major geometric difference between these two ways of thinning a point process. That's the minimal distance between 2 points. When you dilate a point process, when you use geometric dilation, that what's happening is that distances get large. Whereas when you use a random deletion with a Bernoulli variable, then essentially you don't change the minimal distance between points, because with positive probability, you will always have points which are close to one another. And in some sense, that's a crucial modeling issue. But as we will see later, these are only two particular ways of thinning a point process, and maybe you would just want to consider a point process as it is and not thin it. And so that would be some kind of model-free setting, which I will address later. So to come back to my two pictures. So the first way I did was just to select first a sub rectangle and then to dilate the distances. That gave the first one. For the random deletion, what I did is attach Bernoulli variables. When I color it, it means that I will erase the points, and that gave that. So it was two ways to do it. So outline of the talk. So first I will describe you how to derive the effective viscosity in the case of the Stokes problem. So that's slightly more involved than for the conductivity problem, but it remains a qualitative result. Then I will introduce the main combinatorial tool to the analysis, that's so-called cluster expansion of the solution. As we will see, there's a problem of renormalization in this cluster expansion. And so there's something we've called the magical estimates. So there are estimates which are kind of surprising and which provide an implicit renormalization. So I will, so most of the most difficulty here, the main difficulty is the renormalization problem. And we do it by an implicit way here, except at order 1 and 2, where you have explicit formulas. And that's, for the first one, the formula by Einstein, and the second one by Batchelor. And in the last two sections, I will discuss the model-free setting. So there will be the question of what is the parameter. You know, when you have this random deletion setting, you know that the parameter is the p, the Bernoulli variable. When you dilate, the parameter is the distance, the dilation parameter. So what's the parameter when you don't have a model for the diluteness? So that will be the fifth section, and then I will present you the general results. Okay, so what are the equations? So blue is now back the water, white, that's the particles of sugar, which are rigid balls. So they are centered at the point process, which is stationary and ergodic. I assume that the minimal distance between any two particles is positive, and that my suspended particles are colloidal in the sense that they have the same density as the fluid. So there is no gravity here, and particles are very small. Okay, I rescale my point set. So these are the equations. So you have the Steady-Stokes equation outside the particles. The divergence of the velocity is 0. I assume that the velocity vanishes at the border of my tank. And these particles are rigid, so they need to be a rigid body motion inside. And then I have two constraints, which is essentially Newton's law. So the main qualitative result here is that when you let epsilon go to 0, then you recover, so the solution U epsilon converges to a solution U bar of a similar problem. So that's still a Stokes equation, but now you're on the whole domain. You still have the divergence V constraint, you have the same boundary condition. Here, the right-hand side have 1 minus lambda F instead of F, where lambda is the density of the particles. Well, that's not surprising because here the F is imposed outside. So if you think of weak convergence, it will converge to the measure of this set times F and locally, and so that will be 1 minus lambda. The interesting thing is this B bar, which will be the effective viscosity, and which is given essentially as you would expect. So that's the energy density of a corrector. The only thing is that the Stokes system, so this is the symmetrized gradients, and I need to pick a direction E, which is trace free. Okay, so that's not so surprising for people from homogenization. Let me just talk a little bit on this solution psi. So this is the energy density of a corrector, and the corrector is the solution of that problem on the whole space. So that's the same. That's the Stokes equation outside the inclusions. You're a rigid body motion inside the inclusions, and then you have balance of stress and momentum. So if you want to understand essentially what's, okay, that's a typo, that's a psi. What's that psi? That psi is linear. Okay, that psi is linear at large scale. So namely, you have a you may have a correction, but that's a small O of X. Because my psi is written like EX plus V. So essentially, you want to be EX, but you cannot, and so you correct it. And so I've said that psi must be a rigid body motion. So the UI and the omega I here, the boundary conditions on the balls, they are unknowns. They are the Lagrange multipliers for the equilibrium of stress and momentum. So in some sense, that problem is really nonlinear with respect to the position of the particles, because you know that it's a rigid body motion, but you don't know which rigid body motion. And so the subtle part actually for the proof is to prove that the grad phi and the pressure is stationary. That's the only difficulty with respect to the standard problem. Okay, so that's essentially what I said. So the important thing is that the pressure can mean chosen stationary. That's That's a bit subtle. And so that's the Stokes equation. We need some regularity at the boundary. So we need to do some local surgery. So we use a lot the Bogovsky operator. And then in terms of the homogenization per se, that's as usual Tartar oscillating test function. And we have a corrector result, but that's not needed here. So before I go further, I need to introduce the periodic approximation. As I told you, I mentioned several times already, that one of the difficulties will be the renormalization. And so to avoid any problem of divergence, I will replace the whole space by a bounded set, say QL, to be a cube of size L. And so I solve the same equation in that domain. The only thing is I have to choose the inclusions. Of course, I don't want the inclusion to cut the boundary. So I just take the inclusion which are really inside the cube. And then I define my approximation of B as follows. So I take the L for periodic. So that's 1 plus the expectation of the Dirichlet norm of the corrector. So this would be a random variable, and I take the expectation. When L goes to infinity, then essentially this term also converges to the expectation. So I don't need the expectation at the limit, but I need it at L finite. And by qualitative homogenization, I have the convergence. Okay, so the main tool to study this B bar is a so-called cluster expansion. So let me spend some time on that. So N for me, so the inclusions I labeled by N. Okay, so that's the inclusion IN, and my set of inclusion is the union of all inclusions. And now if I take H, which is a subset of N, then my inclusion set capital H is just the union of inclusions, but now with index N, which belongs to H. So the E, let's forget about that for now. And then I consider the corrector. So capital L, that's for periodic, and the little l, I will come back to that later, and E is the direction. And so H is, so the periodic, so this psi H is the solution of this equation where IL is replaced by IH. So if there is no inclusion, then the corrector is 0. If I picked all the inclusions, then that's the usual corrector. And otherwise, that's the solution with a certain number of inclusions. Given that, I introduce a difference operator I call delta n. And delta n applied to this periodic corrector is just the difference between psi with my original inclusion union the inclusion n minus psi h, which means that if n is already in H, this is 0, right? But if n is not in H, this measures how much the corrector depends on adding an inclusion. Then, of course, you can define higher order difference operator. You just iterate this thing. So if I take now f, which is a subset of n, then I define delta f as the product of delta n for n in f. And if you do a little bit of combinatorics, then you realize that this delta f of psi h is given by that. So here, that's typically the sum over all subset of f. This f minus g, this is just the number of points in f minus g, and that's this corrector in g union h. So why is this interesting? This is interesting because of the following. So you can expand, you can use these difference operators to write an approximation of your corrector. So I just make a Taylor expansion, if you like, where the derivatives, the role of the derivatives is played by this difference operator. And I use this proxy, which I will rewrite like that. So why is this interesting? That's interesting because if you're on a bounded domain, like my cube QL, right? Then if I choose K large enough, this is not an approximation, this is just an identity. Why? Because this is a telescopic sum, if you like. Here you have, in this thing, you have minus delta N1. If you look at what this gives you psi N1, N2 minus psi N1 minus psi N2, which exactly cancel with that one. So essentially, here I only have, so this is 0 particle, this is 1 particle, this is 2 particles, this is K particles, but you always subtract the contribution of the one before you. So at the end here, if I have NK particles, then this is nothing but the true solution. So this is kind of an expansion of your solution where you consider group of particles interacting together. And so this is finite when you consider the corrector on the box. This is not finite when you consider the true corrector on the whole space, because you have an infinite number of particles, so then it's not clear that this expansion converges. So this is the reason why we place yourself in a bounded domain. So that's the periodic approximation. And so the first result is an explicit expansion of the effective viscosity. And so don't really look at the formulas. What you should remember from this slide is the fact that the effective conductivity admits an expansion, that the Bernoulli variable is multiplicative. So here that I have this random deletion with P, and actually I have an expansion with terms of order P to the J. And that's a bit magical. And then there's a remainder, and I have formulas for both the coefficients and the remainder. So the coefficient of order J involves a sum over J particles. So that's interaction of J particles. The remainder, that's interaction between K plus 1 particle. But here you see that I have the true corrector. I have the stress tensor of the true corrector, whereas here I just have a finite number of particles. Okay, so when you look at this expansion, the scaling in P is clear. That's the magic of Bernoulli variables, so that's independence. The scaling of, so this, now, okay, so I should have told it, P is for random dilation, L is the geometric dilation, and L is the periodicity. So this little L is the minimal distance between points, if you like, the typical distance between points. And as I said in the beginning, P and L to the minus D should play similar roles. Here, that's quite clear how this P pops up. That's much less clear for this B, L little l. And actually, it should scale like L to the minus JD. And it is much more difficult to establish. And then there's the question, okay, take P equals 1, L equals 1. This is still true. That's just an identity. What's the scaling of these guys? So as I said, BLJ involves the interactions between groups of J particles. So in particular, if you believe that hydrodynamic interactions were local or integrable, then actually BJ would scale like the soup over positions in space of the expectation of J distinct points of the indicator function of X and B in QZ1, QZG. That would just be what it is. And that's what we define to be the higher order intensity. If you think of J equals 1, so take J equals 1, I take the supremum in Z, there's only one Z, of the expectation of the sum over all points of the indicator function that this point belongs to the cube centered at Z. By stationarity, I can take Z to be 0. Okay, so I just don't have the sup, and I have the expectation of the sum over all points of the indicator function that this point belongs to the unit cube. Well, how many points do I have that satisfy that? Lambda, when I take the expectation. That's just the usual intensity of a point process. You take the unit cube, how many points can you find there? Well, that's just the average number of points. So that's the usual intensity. Okay, so this is a definition of higher order intensity. And we believe that Bj should scale like lambda j if the hydrodynamic interactions were local. And so if you want this to be meaningful, you want that to be an expansion such that the remainder is smaller than the last term. The last term being lambda k, if you believe in that, it means that you would like the remainder to be less than lambda k plus 1, which should be much less than lambda k. That should be essentially the assumptions you want to make for the validity of Einstein relations. So here come the magical estimates. So the magical estimate is essentially that one. You can prove that Bjl is bounded by G factorial times Cl to the minus Dj, which in particular tells you that this is summable, provided Bl to the minus D is small enough. So actually that's an extension to all order of a result by Gérard Varret and Hilaire at order 2. So of course they cannot consider the summability. So here you could ask me the question, where's this capital L? So here I said I need the capital L because I need it to be well defined. So I need the sums to be finite. And here there's no capital L anymore. Well, it turns out that the estimates here are uniform in capital L. You know that BL converges to B. So actually there's no choice. Each of the BLLJ converges to some BLJ, which satisfies this uniform estimate. And so that's clear for the Bernoulli variable. And now there's a nice probabilistic argument. You just choose a random point set, which is given. And then you add an artificial Bernoulli variable. And then you deduce the convergence of the BJL for your original process. And actually, this gives you that the bound is now of order 1. Oh, sorry, I should have said J factorial. Whereas you expect it to be lambda J factorial. So essentially, you don't have the nice dependence on the density of the process, but you have boundedness and the existence of a limit. And that's what we call the implicit renormalization. So why are these estimates magical? Well, they are magical because, okay, so that's hard to see because of the following. So essentially look at these estimates. So I have, so this is correctors. Okay, I have correctors. This is just the difference operator. And what's the catch here? Here I sum over F inside the square, and there I sum over G outside the square. And essentially this estimates, so this proposition tells you that you can pull out sums from the square without changing the value of the bound. So that's a kind of family of mixed L1, L2 estimates. So the proof, that's again a lot of combinatorics and a double induction argument where you use several reformulations of the equation where you change the operator. you have an operator with a certain number of inclusions, and then you iterate this operator. What is subtle here is the scaling in L, because it does not come for free, so you have to make it come up, and to do that, you use elliptic regularity. So essentially, by assumption, you know that particles are far away. So in a very large ball, there's only one particle, and there you use that the solution is a solution of the three Stokes equation, so essentially harmonic if you like, and then you use elliptic regularity, like mean value and duality. Okay, so now what we have is a definition of the terms of the expansion. I can pass to the limit in the periodization. So I have some expansion with terms. And now the thing is, can I evaluate the value of this term? And it turns out that for the first term, that's pretty simple. There's only one inclusion. Okay. So the inclusion is solution of this equation, but instead of being on the whole space and on the big cube. And so the question is just, can you pass to the limits when you consider one solution on the big cube or on the whole space? And obviously the answer is yes. And then you recover Einstein formula. But of course, that was the starting point of Einstein. The second order is more subtle. Essentially, what you have is that this should be the solution. This should be the formula. So F is the 2-point density of my point process. The problem is that this is not summable. So this term, this has no decay, that's over the 1. And when you look at the decay of these guys, this is not enough, this is precisely D. So if you like this case, like Z to the minus D. And so Z to the minus D is not integrable. And so you cannot make sense of this. So in the formula above, I've essentially split up and added terms which vanish. So this one compensates that one, which compensate that one. So essentially you could say I did nothing, I added 0. But by adding 0, what I did is here I'm decaying better. I've gained one additional power. So now this decay is like D minus 1. This one as well, D minus 1. Okay, that one does not decay as D minus 1. But what I can do now is subtract this lambda squared, because this term is 0 when you integrate it against a constant. And this now might have a decay at infinity. And this might make sense. Okay, so what about the, okay, so here that gives me the formula for the first term, the formula for the second term, and I even have convergence rates for both. The main question is, what can you say in the model-free setting? So I remind you, the crude dimensional analysis would tell you that Bj scales like lambda j, and I would like the remainder to be smaller than the last term. So up to now, what I've proved is that I can pass to the limit in all the terms of my expansion. This makes sense, but I don't know the scaling, and I don't know the scaling of the remainder. And the main difficulty is that the cluster expansion is not summable. Okay, so you can use instead of this magic, so the magic estimates are nice, but they only work if you are in a specific setting when you have a 1-parameter family which will allow you to describe the dilution, either by Bernoulli or by dilation. Okay, so I don't have access to these estimates in this setting, so I'm just being pedestrian, and I use Green's function estimates and estimates on their perturbations. So the only thing I assume is that I have bounds on the corrector. So I assume that for some S, I have that local averages of the gradient of the corrector to the power S. When I integrate on the torus or QL, that's bounded by the density of the point process. Well, actually, that's true. For S equals 2, that's trivial. That's the energy estimate. For S slightly larger than 2, that's Meyer's estimate, which is also true. Okay, if you assume that, then what you have is that the term of the expansion, this B, capital L, scales almost like lambda J, but you have a logarithmic correction. So it blows up when L goes to infinity. The same with the remainder. So the question is, how can you prevent this blow up? Actually, you can't. So you need additional information. And so the main results of the talk are the following. So at first order, actually, you don't need anything. You just assume that lambda 2 is much less than lambda 1 in a slightly quantified way. So I assume that lambda 2 is less than lambda 1 plus beta for some beta positive. So if I had a Poisson point process, lambda 2 would be lambda squared, right? So that would be trivially true. But this does not need to be like that, because you could think of a point process where when you have one particle, you want to have another one close, nearby. But this shouldn't happen too often, and that's the condition. And in this case, then you have that the B1 is of order lambda, that's the Einstein formula if you want, and you have control of the error by replacing the effective viscosity by its first order term. And you can even quantify that. And actually it was proved independently by David Jarava and Richard Hofer at the same time as we did this theorem. Then we also go to second order. To second order, we make almost no assumption besides a strengthening of the condition lambda 3 less than lambda 2. So there's a small condition which is on the algebraic decay of correlation, but that's really minimal. That's in order to be able to make the Batchelor renormalization. And then with the same S as above, so the Meyer's exponent, then we have that B2 is bounded by lambda 2 log lambda 2. And then we have this bound on the second order expansion. So that's essentially without many assumptions here. So that's really a model-free setting. And if you want to go higher order, then you have to do two things. First, you strengthen even more your condition lambda k plus 1 less than lambda k, and then you need the convergence rate. So let's assume that my period approximation by periodization converges at some rate, algebraic rate, and I ask that for all L and for all P. So I add this Bernoulli variable, which is again a trick. I mean, that's just an artificial variable. If you assume that, then you recover a nice bound of the Bj. So that's bounded by lambda j. Okay, that's what you expect, but there's a logarithmic correction. And with the same S as before, if you assume that there exists, so you're at step K, you want an approximation of the case first expansion. If you know that there exists some nk, so some order, at which the intensity of order n of k is less than lambda k plus 1 to some power, which is bounded by 2, that power, then actually you have the nice bound on the expansion. So let me discuss the assumptions. So the first one was this quantitative rate. Well, that's a very mild assumption. Actually, it holds under alpha mixing uniformly in L and P. Okay, that should be P, not L. And the argument is the one similar to Armstrong and Mura for homogenization of the conductivity problem. So we just have to adapt a little bit to that case. An interesting feature is that the rate that you have for that can be transmitted to the approximation, to the term of the expansion. And that's again using the artificial Bernoulli variable. So the log here for the bound follows from optimizing in L between the pedestrian approach and this thing. And what is interesting, I think, is that for j equals 2 at least, the logarithmic correction is sharp. Actually, you can find examples for which B2 scales like lambda 2 log lambda 2. And from the analytic point of view, this logarithm has the same origin as the lack of continuity of the Helmholtz projection in L infinity. Then the assumption that lambda n of k is less than lambda k plus 1 to some power is quite mild because you can choose nk to be as large as you like. So at some point it decorrelates. So it should be true. And then there's this S here. And actually S can be large. So we know it's larger than 2. It can be taken arbitrarily large if you assume that the distance between particles are large. So that's some kind of perturbative LS estimate. And the proof of that is based on the reflection method. Or if you have high moments on the correctors. And then that's more quantitative homogenization. Okay, so to conclude, let me come back to the order 1 and 2 and tell you why I didn't need a convergence rate in those cases. So there I didn't have to assume any quantitative mixing condition. And actually that comes from the following interesting proposition that you can have a bound on the convergence of BL to its limit B. So L to the minus epsilon, so that's good. But then you have a diverging term, but this one is multiplied by the intensity, which anyway limits your accuracy at the end. So this log does not hurt. And so that's as if you had a nice convergence rate. So you can again optimize in L. So for the first part, that's quite straightforward. For the second part, so you go to second order. This is not straightforward, and that's based on Bachelor renormalization. And then sandwiching the effective viscosity using Dirichlet-Neumann boundary condition using an indirect probabilistic argument, because actually Bachelor does not hold for Neumann boundary condition. So you have to work a little bit, but then it gives you that result. And yes, to conclude, I'd like to mention the separation assumption. So in all the results above, I assume that particles were at distance, there was a minimal distance between particles. It could be small, but it needed to be there. And so why? That was because of the regularity theory for the Stokes equation around the boundary. And that was already needed for the qualitative results. So even to define the effective viscosity. You can weaken this assumption. So that's a work by Mitya Dürings. So it was inspired by a result by Kozlov on the conductivity problem for infinite conductivity. So you have to assume a non-degeneracy assumption on the curvature of your inclusion. So typically it's true for spheres. And then in order to be able to define the effective viscosity, in dimension larger than 3, there's no condition. In dimension 2, you just need the log of rho. So the expectation of the log of rho to be to some power. So I think 1 is okay to be finite. In dimension 2, that's more restrictive. And this thing in dimension 3 is interesting because it's compatible with physical behavior of two particles evolving in a Stokes law. And in this context, we can also prove the validity of Einstein's viscosity formula, but it's not clear for higher order because we use Meyer's estimates. And with this fine thing, you don't have the Meyer's estimates so easily. So I think how much time do I have? I guess
1 minute.
1 minute. So just a bonus. The bonus is sedimentation. So I had neglected gravity. So here that's just a little observation. If you want to put back gravity, then the thing is you have to modify so the thing was, if you add gravity that the particles have the same mass density as the fluid, you see nothing. I mean, you just rescale everything. But if the particles are heavier, they will fall, right? So in the corrector equation, you will see that in the stress balance, you have the gravity or the buoyancy. So that's the difference between the gravity felt by the particles and the gravity felt by the fluid. And this brings energy to the system. And so that's if you were in a tank, that would be the description of what's happening in your sedimentation tank. And you want to define the effective sedimentation speed as the average of the speed of each particle. And as opposed to the previous case where I had G equals 0, the existence is much more challenging and requires a lot of cancellations. Okay, so, and that's related to this hyperuniformity business that I wanted to mention for the discussion at the end of the day. So, okay, we'll just stop here and answer question if you have some.
Okay, thank you so much, Anton, for a wonderful talk. We'll start the questions.
Yes. One.
Marcel?
Okay, thank you for the very interesting talk. As a physicist, usually Stokes-Einstein to me is something that relates the diffusion coefficient, which is a sort of equilibrium property, to the viscosity, which is another equilibrium property. So it's what we call in physics the fluctuation dissipation theorem in a special case. So here, and so it relates the diffusion coefficient to the viscosity through the temperature. So it's not something where, and this is unusual to me to see this as an effective viscosity, you know. So it's a different thing. So I'm not sure I know how to relate both. And is there a temperature somewhere here, or did I miss something?
So here there was no temperature, and the relation you were mentioning is what I call the Einstein relation in kinetic theory, and actually that relation is also in that paper.
Yes.
So in that paper there were the two relations, and it did
Okay,
both.
that's why I was confused about this thing. You know, I was okay.
And that's why
So
I
this-
said that one was a bit forgotten.
Okay, sorry about that. And so I had another question that's more to the topic. Is that I tried to follow you, but I have to say I was lost in the in the proof and somewhere. So you have a particle with exactly the same size everywhere. So does it play a role, or can you change the distribution of sizes? And will you keep the result in how much can you change the distribution of sizes? You know,
Okay,
for example,
so
we know that if we have like what a Napoleonic packing or power law scaling for the distribution of size, you must have a problem. You know.
Okay. So the results that I've studied were for unit balls, etc. The proof is still more it's more robust than that, but that's true. That's first the thing, we want to somehow disconnect the point process from the inclusion process. So you have center of inclusion, that's my point process, and I put an inclusion. Okay, I could put spheres, I could put something larger, I could put anything. Still, I need to have this condition. Okay, and I need the diameter of my inclusions to be bounded. So I cannot have a power law for the distribution of the size. Okay,
but sort of just having a bound on the size is enough.
It's fine. Yeah. And for the Einstein formula, actually it was. So I think I've written it.
I mean a lower bound, or it's a lower bound, or.
Oh no, that's an upper bound.
An upper bound.
You could have small particles.
Okay, but then if you have small particles, you know, you can do the trick. You know, if you have a particle of a given size, and then after you can fill the void of the particle of a given size with the particle of smaller sizes, and so on and so on and so on, until almost you jam the system, no?
No, because of my nice assumption, which is the fact that the distance is positive. So that you cannot jam.
Ah, okay, that's
so the size of the particle might be small, the distance is uniform. And so you can do your jamming. I don't know whether you
have a lower bound on the positive of the minimal distance. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So maybe, so I don't know how much you can jam with this assumption, because it's still much weaker than this uniform one. So that one is a uniform assumption. That one is not uniform. It's just a random assumption. I mean, that's more about.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Speak up, because I cannot see the entire room behind the screen.
Okay, so if you didn't like the subject, you have to you have to blame me. Just
I have a question. It's a bit vague, but so to follow with your assumption that you have a minimum distance between the points, that induces a correlation between the points, right? So
Well, yes, but that's quite minimal. For instance, for the hardcore Poisson process, we know that it's exponentially mixing. So essentially that's very weak.
Have you studied like if you try to like enforce some correlation, do you have a different result? Because you were talking about hyperuniformity, so I guess this is related to this question of
here,
correlation.
the thing is, so that might change the value of, so let's go to the expansion. So I have an expansion here. So of course, the law of the inclusions will change the value of the Beiji, right? But the validity of the expansion and the bound is essentially does not depend on this. It only depends on that assumption, which is a mixing condition, of course, but that's very, very mild. Because essentially, so here you can get that with alpha mixing, but with alpha mixing with a very fat tail. You know, I need nothing. It's just, okay, nothing is not nothing because it's algebraic, but it's essentially very, very minimal. And whereas hyperuniform, I mean, it's very far from being an independent, for instance. It's very far for a Poisson process or for hyperuniform process. I just need to have some rate at some point. So that's technical, but it needs to be there because if it were not there, I wouldn't have the log here, which I know is sharp. So it needs to be there. But for hyperuniformity, I don't think here it has such an importance, but in the sedimentation problem, that's fundamental. And could just mention two theorems here. So if you take the sedimentation problem, so that's that one, okay, that psi should be a phi. Okay. So the thing is, there's the G here. So you put energy into the system. If you look at the, okay, so if you look at the energy estimate you have by doing nothing, then you realize that even the gradient square of your solution scales like the, so T should be the size of the domain. Okay, which is not correct. So your energy estimate overestimates everything. Well, if you assume that you have a hardcore Poisson point process for the points, then actually you can do much better. In dimension larger than 2, you can define the gradient of the velocity, and in dimension 3, the velocity itself, if you look at its variance, it grows like L, so like the size of the tank in dimension 3, like the log in dimension 4, and like 1 in dimension larger than 4. So actually, this is something you see experimentally. If you start from sedimentation, so you take particles, you just stir your tank, and then you let the particles fall. At the beginning, you will see this dependence on the size of the tank. And then after some time, there will be some kind of rearrangement of the particle, and then it won't be like that anymore. It would be like the following one. In dimension 3, you won't have any dependence anymore on the variance. And that's something you can prove is P satisfies a hyperuniform, if P is hyperuniform. So there's a transition between if you hardcore Poisson process, you have the growth of the L2 norm, and if you hyperuniform, you have no growth because there's a shift in dimensions. And from the analysis point of view, that's really surprising because it tells you that the nonlinear, so it's clear, it's easy to prove that at the level of a linearized version of your equation. If you'd want to do it at the nonlinear setting, in the nonlinear setting, then you have to prove that nonlinearity does not destroy hyperuniformity, and hyperuniformity is something very linear. And so that's very surprising that this nonlinearity does not destroy that. And when you do the analysis, of course, you understand why it's true, but at the beginning it was. So that's the only thing where I see the effect of very precise assumptions on the level of what I've presented. if you like, the thing on Einstein's formula is very qualitative. And you see that when you understand that you need really minimal quantitative assumptions to make it work. Just an epsilon room of space. I don't know how you say that. You just need a little space to do things, to do some analysis. Whereas here, that's crucial. That's the thing which makes it work.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's quite amazing that you got more questions from physicists than from mathematicians.
And
we still have more. I have still more questions, but I'll let the other.
Let's eat, maybe.
Okay. Okay. Oh, okay.
We'll
I didn't see that.
12:45 and more questions to Anton tonight.
All right, I see.
3 p.m. our time.
So when do we reconvene? 45?
12:45 or 45 of whatever hour you have right now.
Okay, 45
So
in half an hour.
In half
Half
an
an
hour.
hour. Okay.
You have time to have dinner and some of us lunch. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you.
Ah, yeah, we should have clapped. I'm sorry, Anton.
Okay.
I should have clapped this.
Bye.
It's serial times. Okay, see you in half an hour.
Yep.